Welcome to Web Lecture 1.3. Today we're going to be talking about colonial North America and mostly the causes of the American Revolution. Now, in order to discuss the causes of the American Revolution, we first have to talk about the relationships between the British and the colonies. Now, when it first started, we had several different types of colonies. We know we had charter colonies, where there was an agreement between the king and the colonies. We also had royal colonies, where there was a governor in the colony as a representative of the king, and then there were proprietary colonies and penal colonies. Now, all of these different colonies each had different relationships with the king, but more or less the king's idea of a relationship was what we call salutary neglect. Now, salutary neglect basically meant that the king pretty much ignored the colony as long as the colony was doing what he wanted them to do. And so that meant that he kept his soldiers out, that meant that he got the money, he sent supplies, and that relationship was solid. Now, obviously, this salutary neglect was beneficial for the colonists because largely it gave them the opportunity to do essentially what they wanted to do as long as they were paying tribute to the king. Now, this did not last, though, because the king in 1651 decided to impose what were called the Navigation Acts. And the Navigation Acts were basically created to make the colonists realize that the king really was the one that was in power. It was implemented to show how much power the crown had. And the basic idea was that the king wanted to make sure that the merchandise and the raw materials that were being collected and produced in the colonies were only being exported to England, because at the time the colonists were exporting to France and Spain and the Netherlands, and the king wanted to put an end to that. So he made it so that the colonies could only export to England and could only import goods from England. So essentially that created a monopoly of import and export with the colonies. He also went so far as to say that they could only transport the goods, these import and export goods, on British ships. So this really tightly controlled what was going on in the colonies as far as trading went. Now, this worked by and large, but there were some people that went against this, and it created some piracy and also some people that were trading illicitly with other countries and by other means besides British ships. So this started to create a little bit of a problem with the king and the colonies, but it wasn't hugely influential in creating problems with the British that the colonists couldn't get over. Because obviously you can see this was 1651. The American Revolution doesn't happen until 1776. Now, something that was going on in the colonies was the House of Burgesses. The House of Burgesses was the first elected legislative assembly. This legislative assembly was, in essence, a body of lawmakers that represented the Virginia people. Now, this was only part of the government in Virginia because obviously Virginia was also a royal colony, and so they had a governor, most famous of whom was William Berkeley, who we talked about when we were discussing Bacon's Rebellion. But in Jamestown, they created this first legislative body in 1619. That was the first time that the House of Burgesses met, and this was a step toward giving the colonists some say in their government. However, ultimately, the governor had the final say and had to report back to the king. So this was just a small step, which led eventually to this idea of representative government, which we have in the United States, in our House and in our Senate, and at all levels in our state and local government as well. So this was a very important precedent that was established by the House of Burgesses. Now, another thing that kind of gets colonists thinking about stepping away from the British rule was what was called the Enlightenment. Now, the Enlightenment was happening in 18th century Europe. So we're talking about the 1700s when this is going on. And basically the idea behind the Enlightenment was to put the power in reason. So we're not talking about emotional or any kind of ideas outside of very specific rationale. And so What the Enlightenment thinkers hoped to do was to reform society by advancing knowledge, so using a knowledge-based idea to control the government, the people, the economy, and so this was very important, and it really made people think, particularly people in the colonies. Because basically this was making sure that there was no abuse by either the church or the state, because that was not rational. And people would not stand up to this, to an unrational idea of government or church. And so philosophers like John Locke and Montesquieu, who we've talked about both of, really were big Enlightenment philosophers, and their writings, which were big in the Enlightenment, led to ideas like the Declaration of Independence. We've talked about that similarity between Locke's idea of natural rights of life, liberty, and property, and the Declaration of Independence, which mentions life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And then we talked about Montesquieu and how his ideas led to the checks and balances in our government, and several other philosophers, including Locke, gave us the ideas that eventually created our Bill of Rights. So this period was very, very important. Now, when we continue this relationship with the British, conflict happens in the colonies as well. Now, at this time, we're talking about still a British group of colonies, and this conflict starts with the French. Now, if we look at the map, we are talking about a conflict that starts down in this area, right around modern-day Pittsburgh, here at Fort Duquesne and Fort Necessity. Fort Duquesne was a French fort, and that was a pretty strong French fort. It had been there for a while. The French really settled this area mostly. And then the Fort Necessity was a British fort, and this British fort was created by George Washington, who was a British soldier at the time. And George Washington went out there and he decided that he wanted to settle this area for the British. But clearly this created a big problem between the French and the British, because they both wanted this land, because the Ohio River runs right down through here, and it creates this very big area of fertile land. This is all very fertile land right in here. And so that's what everybody wanted. And so George Washington attacked the French fort, Fort Duquesne, but was quickly turned around and sent back to Philadelphia with his tail tucked between his legs, because he was not prepared to battle the British in this area. Well, while this was going on, this really sort of started this battle between the French and the British. Now, eventually we call this the French and Indian War, not because the French were fighting the Indians, but because the Indians in this area decided that they were going to ally with the French. The French seemed like they had a stronger position, and also the French sort of fell more in line with the Native American ideals, because they did not necessarily create settlements like the British colonists did. They kind of set up forts and used the land, but didn't necessarily want to create whole colonies. So the French and the natives decided to fight against the British. Now, when this was going on,